I like this audience. Thank you. Thank you so much for this wonderful honor and this wonderful warm greeting, the opportunity to be with you here at truly a historic moment. This country has the presidency of the G20, and this is a truly historic opportunity and a sign of the great leadership of Africa. And I want to make one note of the arithmetic of what is involved in the meeting tomorrow. As you know, 2 years ago, the G20 expanded by welcoming the African Union to full membership, an absolutely wonderful occasion which brought the 1.4 billion people of Africa into proper representation in this group. And I had been waiting and urging that we, of course, rename the group as the G21. And it should be, except we have had a favor. Donald Trump is staying home. So not only did we go G20, G21, back to G20, Africa has replaced the United States in the proper center. And it's going to be a wonderful meeting without Mr. Trump tomorrow, believe me. I know, because I've been hearing from my colleagues who have been at COP30 in Brazil, another meeting that the United States skipped, how absolutely pleasant the meeting was. So I'm very much looking forward to the events in the next 2 days. And I am sure that they will bring true luster to this country and to this continent. And Vice Chancellor, I'm a little late, but I'm here. When you beckoned, I knew that I would be here. I'm celebrating the 152nd anniversary of this great school, and that's even better than the 150th anniversary. So this is an added plus. What an esteemed institution this is, and what a crucial institution. And not only did the Vice Chancellor make this wonderful invitation to me, but she gave me a wonderful assignment also, because she assigned me a topic. And the topic is really in every way exactly pertinent. The topic is solidarity, social justice, and reclaiming the future, the role of universities in contested geopolitics. Vice Chancellor, I love every word of the title, because every word is truly essential for our time. As I'll emphasize, solidarity, and especially African unity, is crucial for solving the problems that we face. Social justice is at the core of our agenda. As the UN says, where I work, leave no one behind. Everyone comes forward together. Reclaiming the future is a very important concept. We are claiming the future, making the future, but also we have to understand the past and what was taken and what needs to be reclaimed, because this is also an important part of our reality. And then after the colon of those three ideas of solidarity, social justice, and reclaiming the future is the role of the university in contested geopolitics. And I want to emphasize the role of the university is unique and indispensable. And this university is absolutely remarkable and will play a fundamental, transformative role for all of Africa in the years ahead. And if I can help in any way, I want to say right at the outset, it would be a joy, a pleasure, an honor, because what you are doing is absolutely pivotal to the future not only of this country, but also to the future of all of Africa, and that means the future of the whole world. So this is really extraordinary. I want to read something to you, because it is, if I can find it, yeah. It's a passage, little bit archaic in language, but it's my favorite passage from the fundamental text of economics, but of the best kind, I think. And that's the book written 249 years ago by Adam Smith, who we call the founder of thinking about economics for our time. And he was really a wonderful thinker. He was a genius, and he was also a humanist, a very decent man. And he wrote 249 years ago in 1776 a couple paragraphs that have stuck with me my whole career, but I think are very pertinent for our discussion this evening. So if you'll permit me to just quote a rather long quote, but I'll explain why it fits exactly about reclaiming our future and the role of universities and contested geopolitics. So this is what Adam Smith wrote in 1776. He said, "The discovery of America and that of a passage to the East Indies by the Cape of Good Hope are the two greatest and most important events recorded in the history of mankind." It's a big statement. "Their consequences have already been very great." And remember, he was writing about Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492 and Vasco da Gama's circling the Cape of Good Hope on the way to India in 1498. So he was already writing more than 2.5 centuries later. And he says their consequences have already been very great. But in the short period between 2 and 3 centuries, which has elapsed since those discoveries were made, it is impossible that the whole extent of their consequences can have been seen. What benefits or what misfortunes to mankind may hereafter result from those great events, no human wisdom can foresee. By uniting in some measure the most distant parts of the world, by enabling them to relieve one another's wants, to increase one another's enjoyments, and to encourage one another's industry, their general tendency would seem to be beneficial. So he's saying by connecting the different parts of the world, this should be, in general, a benefit. That now the Americas are connected with Europe, Europe's connected with Asia by sea-based trade. This should be beneficial. But then he goes on, because he was an extremely decent and learned man, he says, "To the natives, however, both of the East and West Indies, all the commercial benefits which can have resulted from those events have been sunk and lost in the dreadful misfortunes which they have occasioned. These misfortunes, however, seem to have arisen rather from accident than from anything in the nature of those events themselves. At the particular time when these discoveries were made, the superiority of force happened to be so great on the side of the Europeans that they were enabled to commit with impunity every sort of injustice in those remote countries." And this is what I really like. So he's saying it should have benefited everybody, but Europe went, beat the hell out of everybody, if you'll excuse me. And they did. And this began the process of European imperialism all over the world. But then Adam Smith, writing in 1776, because of his humanism and his genius and his foresight, said the following, and this is what I think is really key for us today. He said, if I can find it, "Hereafter, perhaps, the natives of those countries may grow stronger, or those of Europe may grow weaker, and the inhabitants of all the different quarters of the world may arrive at that equality of courage and force, which by inspiring mutual fear can alone overawe the injustice of independent nations into some sort of respect for the rights of one another. So in other words, he's saying things can equal out over time. Europe could become weaker, the rest of the world can become stronger, and then there can be a balance of force. And then he says, but nothing seems more likely to establish this equality of force than that mutual communication of knowledge and of all the sorts of improvements which an extensive commerce from all countries to all countries naturally, or rather necessarily, carries along with it. What is he saying? He's saying that writing in 1776, Europe dominated so much of the world. Of course, a century later, Europe would colonize almost all of Africa. So that brutality was pervasive across the Americas, across Asia, and soon after Adam Smith wrote, across almost all of Africa. But then he says this is not the inevitable long term. The world will rebalance. And how will the world rebalance? It will rebalance through knowledge. Sapientia, as your motto says, pro gentibus sapientia, for the public knowledge. So knowledge will enable a rebalancing of force and global justice. And then he says, where will that knowledge, how will that knowledge be transmitted? He says, actually through openness, through trade, through commerce. Different parts of the world will learn the technologies, the skills, so that all parts of the world benefit by the advances in human knowledge. And that sharing of human knowledge will create the just world that an interconnected world should be. Well, I love this section of The Wealth of Nations because, first of all, he got it right. 250 years later, the world has rebalanced. Not fully, but it sure is on its way. That's what we call geopolitics. Nothing less than the world rebalancing. Why isn't Donald Trump coming tomorrow? Because he has a 4-year-old mentality, and he's having a he's having a tantrum. He's having a tantrum. What is the tantrum? That the rest of the world says, we don't want a king. As President Lula said, we don't need an emperor. He would come here as just one of 20 leaders, or 21. He doesn't want that. He's having a tantrum. So this rebalancing is happening. He's having a particular tantrum, by the way, because the United States is in a deeply neurotic funk. You know what the cause of that neurosis is? China. A wonderful, brilliant civilization, 4,000 years old plus. It's been a unified state with brilliant statecraft for more than 2,000 years. Unlike Europe, in which every country of Europe fought every other country of Europe every year for 1,000 years. Most of the time, China was peaceful, united, It fragmented temporarily at some points, but it was mainly a unified country that actually, strangely enough, didn't beat up its neighbors also. So China, for 1,000 years, never attacked Japan, for example. Can you imagine? Britain couldn't keep its hands off any place for more than a year or two at a time. It had to go beat up somebody. And the United States doesn't even take a year off. I don't know the truth yet. It could be an accident, but I don't think so. Today, a major refinery in Venezuela suddenly exploded. That seems a lot like the CIA to me. I don't guarantee it. We don't have any more news. But last week, President Trump said he had assigned the CIA to operations inside Venezuela, and a week later, suddenly the biggest refinery blows up. So the United States can hardly go a week at a time without trying to kill somebody. But China actually goes centuries without attacking its neighbors. So China went for 1,000 years without once invading Japan, a near neighbor, even though China was much more powerful. Incidentally, from 2 times, there was an attempt to invade Japan from the Chinese mainland, but that was when China had been conquered by the Mongols. So 800 years ago, roughly, they tried twice. The Mongols tried to invade Japan, and they were defeated both times. But the Chinese never tried. The Japanese actually, sadly, invaded China many times, but never the other way around. And the Chinese never invaded Korea. And the Chinese did invade Vietnam once, but that was 615 years ago. And then they had a skirmish for 1 month in 1979. Other than that, that's the so-called enemy of the United States. So that's why I call it a neurosis. China's the least threat possible. Doesn't threaten anybody. Doesn't attack anybody. Hasn't been in any war for 46 years, and the war that it was in 46 years ago lasted 1 month. That's when Vietnam toppled a government in Cambodia that China viewed as an ally, and so it punished Vietnam for a month for having overthrown their ally in Cambodia. Other than that, no wars for more than 4 decades. But we're in a funk because the American idea is you have to be number one so you can boss everyone else around. And by the way, we learned every trick we know from the British, who did that for 200 years before that. So that's where the geopolitics comes in. What Adam Smith is saying in 1776 is we need to look forward to a future in which there is equal force, mutual respect, social justice. And we're at that hinge moment of history. Because to my way of thinking, we are at the end of 3 major cycles. First, with these momentous discoveries that Adam Smith talked about, these sea routes that the Europeans found, that began a period of European ascent in the world history and world economy, because Europe was nothing special economically or geopolitically in 1500. You would not put it as likely to succeed or to dominate. But those events changed the course of events. Then in 1750 and really in 1776, oddly enough, the same year that Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, a very skilled engineer, we would say today, but he didn't have that title, a man named James Watt, working at the University of Glasgow, fittingly at a university, stuck a condenser on a steam engine that had been invented decades before, and suddenly the steam engine became incredibly efficient, low cost, and suddenly the industrial age was feasible because of that great invention of the steam engine. That happened, that commercial steam engine of James Watt, which is why we talk about megawatts today, because of Mr. Watt and the power that his steam engine brought. That came in 1776, and Britain was the first country to industrialize, and it really did beat up the rest of the world after that, because the industrialization, the power that came with that, the industrial military led to a worldwide imperialism that dominated the 19th and the first part of the 20th century. And at its apogee, the British Empire had 1/4 of all the people in the world under British imperial domination. Of course, India was a big part of that 25% of humanity. So that's the second part of a cycle. And then, because Europe has a very hard time making peace within Europe. It's really a sickness, actually, I'm sorry to say. We love Europe. My wife's born in Europe, my family comes from Europe, but they fight each other so much. Not my wife and me, but every two countries bear a grudge. Yesterday, I was texting with a friend of mine who wrote to me because he was giving a lecture in Poland, in Warsaw. And I said, yes, it's so sad, the hatred of Russia in Poland. And he said, oh, but remember what Russia did. And he said, you have to remember in 1792. That's what he wrote. And I wrote, get over it. You don't have to fight every time, because in 1792, you fought because the Russians would say, yes, 1792, but in 1610, you invaded us. And that's true, by the way. Poland started it. When Russia was in trouble, in so-called times of trouble in 1610, it was Poland that invaded Russia. Then Russia invaded Poland 150 years later, and they can't stop. And there is, by the way, there's the famous saying of the philosopher George Santayana, the Spanish philosopher of the 20th century, that those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. And my wife has a better one, though. Sonia says those who remember history are condemned to repeat it, because all you do is you bear a grudge for 1,000 years. Get over it. So I think that so I was going to say Europe destroyed itself in 2 civil wars, which we call World War I and World War II. And by the end of the Second World War, Europe was so broken that decolonization came. Not, by the way, because it was inevitable had there not been the wars, but Britain was bankrupt at the end of 1945, after 2 world wars. And Europe had lost any claim whatsoever, not that it deserved it ever, but any claim that it was a civilizing mission or anything else. Not only was it a completely reckless and cruel incivility of the imperial age, but they couldn't even within Europe behave with any decency and slaughtered tens of millions of people. So at the end of World War II, imperialism wasn't quite over, though. Europe lost its colonies step by step. Sometimes there were wars of decolonization in Africa. Sometimes it went more quickly and somewhat peacefully. It all depended. But there was one more empire that was going to stand, and that was the United States empire, because the U.S. became a world empire, and not only a world empire in 1945, and again, having learned the tricks of the trade from Britain, it was a world empire that aspired to dominate the world. And the policy of the United States was there should be no rival. So this was not quite possible because one major power, the Soviet Union itself, did not want to be dominated by the United States, and rather than making peace between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, which were allies in World War II, remember that, they were allies. The U.S. and Britain said, we're enemies of our ally, the one that had actually broken the back of Hitler's army, because the Soviet people lost 27 million in World War II. They bore the brunt of World War II. They defeated Hitler, but the U.S. and Britain did not know how to make peace. They said the Soviet Union's the new enemy, and a Cold War emerged. And I put a lot of the responsibility on the U.S. side for this, because what Russia or the Soviet Union wanted was for Germany to be demilitarized and neutral. And the United States said, no, Germany will be remilitarized and part of our new military alliance, NATO. And the Soviet Union said, now you're a threat to us again. And that led to decades of Cold War. So we lost what could have been the peace. But the United States saw the Soviet Union as, of course, the enemy. The Soviet economic system was not so great, and the U.S. was out to break it in any event through controls on technology and isolation, containment it was called. And as of 1991, the Soviet Union had an economic collapse, and it collapsed into 15 successor states. And I mention this because at that moment, the United States said, oh my God, now we made it. We're alone. We run the world. And believe me, that's how they felt. And that was an illusion, a delusion. They thought Russia, that's a nothing. And they thought China, don't they grow rice there? That's an impoverished country of villages. We don't even have to worry about that. We are the sole superpower of the world. Well, that's not how economics works, actually, because Adam Smith's insight is completely right, which is that if you are fortunate to have open trade, peace, and good economic policies, you get a lot of catching up by the transmission of knowledge, technology, and the opportunities for rapid advance. So while the United States wasn't watching, and I know they weren't watching because they're not very clever there in Washington, I have to tell you, and they don't understand much of economics at all. They weren't paying attention, but China was growing at 10% per year, thank you. And if you do that, you double the size of your economy every 7 years. And if you do that for 35 years, which China did, you've doubled 5 times. And doubling 5 times means you've grown 32 times. And if you continue beyond that, China has increased the size of its economy 40 times since 1980. 40 times. It's now a bigger economy than the United States. It's a much bigger industrial power. It is technologically more advanced than the United States in most sectors, not all, but in most sectors right now. When you drive your vehicles 10 years from now, they will be Chinese electric vehicles. And even if you happen to drive a Tesla, that's a Chinese vehicle, by the way, with Elon Musk at the top. But it's the gigafactory in Shanghai that gives it even a chance to compete. So China made it, and that's why we're at the end of yet another cycle. The European imperial age is over. The British imperial age ended in 1945, and the U.S. imperial age is ending right now. And that's why Donald Trump is home. Because he doesn't want to be one of several. That's all. The delusion is still in Washington, by the way. It's not over. It's still a powerful country. It's still a dangerous country. It's got too big a military. It still has its hands on the valves of the international payment system to a large extent. It can turn on and off the spigot for countries that are vulnerable. Remember, the IMF and the World Bank are U.S. institutions, even though they are multilateral institutions. They were founded for not bad purposes, by the way, but they are American-dominated institutions, and that gives continuing power. And I always emphasize geography in thinking about economics. So the geography is that at Pennsylvania Avenue, which is where the White House is, now there's a West Wing and no East Wing because he knocked it down a couple weeks ago, this idiot. Excuse me. Sorry, it's true. I'm just being technical. At 16th in Pennsylvania is the White House. 15th in Pennsylvania is the Treasury Building. 17th in Pennsylvania is what's called the Executive Office of the President of the U.S. 18th in Pennsylvania is the World Bank. And 19th in Pennsylvania is the International Monetary Fund. So it's only 2 blocks from the President's office to tell the IMF what to do. You don't even need to text it. It takes 30 seconds to walk across the street to say, veto that country's program. And that's still power. But it's power that is fading. It's fading in part because of the BRICS. Because the BRICS are saying, we don't need to be under the thumb of a U.S. empire. That's what President Lula said when he was hosting the BRICS this summer, and Trump put on a tariff on Brazil because he didn't like a court proceeding against the preceding president who had tried to make a coup. And so he put on a penalty tariff, and President Lula said, we don't need an emperor, and we're not going to succumb to this kind of pressure. So the BRICS, of which you are an esteemed member, the S in BRICS, remember the 10 BRICS countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and now Egypt and Ethiopia, United Arab Emirates, Iran, and Indonesia. The 10 BRICS countries have 46% of the world population. Thank you. And 41% of the world GDP. and they can look at the G7 and say, who are you? And that's what they're doing. So this is the new phase of geopolitics. The world is not falling apart, but the US and Europe are having a tantrum. That's different. And the world is not fragmenting. The US is isolating itself. It doesn't even go to the parties anymore. It puts on tariffs. It says, you can't have our market. And the rest of the world says, okay, because your market's not so important for us. And Trump said, okay, we're going to punish you, China, for being so successful, by the way. We're going to put 100% tariff on you. And the next hour, China said, okay, we're putting 120% tariff on you. And then Trump said, okay, we're going to restrict any advanced chips going to you. And China said, okay, no rare earth magnets. And the US, within a half an hour, said, we surrender. By the way, I had no idea there was anything called a rare earth magnet before all of this happened. So I had to ask ChatGPT what it was exactly. It turns out it's absolutely essential for all manufacturing, for automotive, for military, and so on. And China makes them. The US doesn't make them. And so turned out the US learned a bit of a lesson there. Again, yet another reason why Donald Trump is staying home. So this is why we're at such a historic juncture. But the world is really not fragmenting. It's remaining open and it's trading. It's just that one corner of the world is very surly. The part that used to dominate just can't figure out what's going on. And Trump is, of course, trying to flex the military muscles in a disgusting way. The U.S. is still militarily powerful, no doubt about it. The wars in Ukraine and Gaza are imperial wars. The war in Ukraine came because the United States said after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we'll move all our military bases up to the Russian border. And by the way, in 1990, when Germany was reunifying and President Gorbachev was president still of the Soviet Union, the United States promised President Gorbachev, if you, the Soviet Union, agree to the reunification of Germany, which had been divided after World War II in the Cold War, and required the Soviet approval because that was how World War II ended by treaty in 1990. The only real treaty that ended World War II was in 1990. They needed the Soviet agreement. And to get the Soviet agreement, the United States said to President Gorbachev, we promise NATO won't move 1 inch eastward. Not 1 inch. And if you want all the documentary record of that, go to a website called National Security Archive of George Washington University, and go to a website that is called What Gorbachev Heard, and you'll find 42 documents or so that say all of what I just said, that the U.S. promised NATO would never enlarge. But as soon as the Soviet Union ended and the United States said, we're all alone in this, then they started exactly what they promised they wouldn't do, which was eastward enlargement of NATO. And that's why there's the war in Ukraine. It's a disgrace. And it is killing the Ukrainians. And it is part of the famous adage of Henry Kissinger, which you may recall, that to be an enemy of the United States is dangerous, but to be a friend is fatal. Ukraine said, we'll be a friend, and now they're dying because of that. Because they said, okay, NATO enlarged. The United States said, we have your back. And probably 2 million Ukrainians have been killed or gravely wounded in this completely unnecessary and reckless war. And the United States is doing the same with Israel in Gaza. And let me thank you, South Africa, for standing up for justice. It was very brave, very right, very precise to launch the International Court of Justice case on Israel's violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention. The ICJ takes too long to rule, but the evidence that South Africa brought on behalf of the whole world is absolutely right and compelling. So we're in the age of rebalancing, and that's why I liked the title, Reclaiming the Future, because it's not only claiming the future, it is reclaiming what should have been. Had Adam Smith been listened to because he was very decent, this would not have been 200 years of imperialism. This would have been open trade, exchange of ideas, exchange of knowledge. There would have been development in all parts of the world. The imperial age delayed that terribly. I don't have to recount any of that for you here, especially. But I would just say that, to my mind, the greatest crime of imperialism, and imperialism is filled with criminality of the worst kind, but the greatest crime of imperialism, in my view, is the denial of knowledge and of education to the people. Because the basic idea of imperialism, of course, is plunder and extraction and domination. And the basic mechanism of that is to disempower the people. And the most basic empowerment of people, individually and as societies, is knowledge. It is exactly what you say, sapientia. It is knowledge for the people is the most powerful way to advance. It's the essential standard of economic and social development, and it's precisely what the imperialists denied. And by the way, when imperialism ended in Africa, when you looked at the scene, and there's a fascinating study by UNESCO called Illiteracy in the World in 1950, which you can find online because this new organization, UNESCO, in the middle of the 20th century, made a study of worldwide illiteracy. Most of sub-Saharan Africa had illiteracy rates of more than 90%, some between 95 and 100%. That means that when independence came, there had been no education for the people, other than the tiniest exceptions. You know this. This was the mechanism of control. This has made every challenge a challenge of gaining knowledge and of spreading information as absolutely the core of reclaiming the future. So let me turn to the part after the colon of this title, and that is the role of universities in a geopolitically contested age. The role of the universities is the most fundamental institution of societal transformation for the future that we want. The future that we want is a future of sustainable development. Sustainable development means that the future should be prosperous, that yes, we don't reduce poverty, we end poverty. That's sustainable development goal number one. That we have social justice, that we attend to the environmental crises, which are extremely serious and worsening dramatically, and that we live in peace. That's what sustainable development means. Prosperity, social justice, environmental sustainability, and peace and cooperation. In my view, the universities are the central institutions for helping to guide society to the future that we need and the future that we want, to mobilize the knowledge for society on behalf of sustainable development, meaning a prosperous and fair and sustainable future for society. The transformations that we need to achieve that future are rather complicated. We need to ensure, even in poor places, universal access to quality education. You are in the forefront of that design. How to use online learning, how to use the new multimedia methods, how to use artificial intelligence, how to use digital technologies to spread knowledge everywhere. In my view, this is Africa's most important aim and challenge, that the next 20 years should be mass education of quality across this continent. You have the largest cohort of young people in the world. Educate them, train them. Don't let any child lose out. Don't let any government say, we don't have the means, we can't afford this, let's solve this problem, how to make this financing work. But no child is going to have a future that we want for that child if they don't have a quality education. And we need transformations in the same way for universal access to health care and public health, the area where Sonia, my wife, has been working for so many years and working in villages across Africa, showing that at very low cost, by deploying digital technologies, by using the advances as they come, AI or telemedicine and so forth, it's possible to expand access dramatically to health care at very low cost because the tools become better and better. We need to move to a zero-carbon energy system because the burning of the fossil fuels is what's causing the dramatic and accelerating climate change. And there again, Donald Trump was paid for by the oil industry to be put in the White House, so we don't ever know whether he knows anything. But when he says that climate change is a hoax, which he said from the rostrum of the General Assembly, the main reason he's saying it is not even his ignorance, which is unbounded sometimes, but because he was paid to say it by big oil lobbies. But what he's done is to say to China and to Africa and to Europe, you take the future. We'll just close up and deny reality. But this is a transformation that needs to be made. And we need to have advances in agronomy and in sustainable agriculture and land use. And for this continent, this is really essential. You have, of course, unique ecosystems, home to so many species, and they're under threat because of farmlands encroaching, deforestation, even collecting wood for charcoal when solar power would be vastly more effective and efficient. And so we need the transformation of the land use patterns for sustainability. And Africa is going to be welcoming hundreds of millions of people into the cities of Africa in the coming 30 years. And believe me, the rural areas are going to have a significant decline of population, if for no other reason than agriculture is going to be very substantially mechanized in the next 25 years. Robots are going to be doing a lot of the heavy labor. And that means people will be living in cities, and cities need infrastructure, they need design, they need not to get completely clogged up with congestion, they need public transport. I love cities that don't depend on private automobiles, by the way, but depend on public transport that enable walking and bicycling and active mobility, as it's called, but give options other than individual car ownership, because that's a very expensive path to development. So that's another transformation that is needed. And we are going to be in the digital world. And as we were coming up in the elevator, VC, I saw the sign for your program in Information Sciences, the Bachelor of Science in Information Sciences. That's a great skill. And it's a great program. And that is going to be transformative all over the continent as well. So what is the role of the universities? It is to train, to discover the pathways, to innovate, to incubate new businesses in all of those transformative areas, in education, in healthcare, in energy systems, in agronomy, in urban design, in e-governance. You should make all of those things, and your students should make those things. And the universities should be the great incubators of companies that go off and design new ways to do all of this. And I've learned, as I've mentioned in the last few days here, something I've advised governments all over the world for 40 years, actually, this year, because I began that activity actively in 1985 in Bolivia, and I've advised probably well over 100 governments since then. Governments don't think. I'm not dissing them, by the way. They need to implement. They need to make coalitions. They need to solve political problems. They need to build bases, not military bases, bases of support. But they don't have time to think. And it's not even their job. And it's not even their qualifications. So we should do the thinking for them, thank you. It's just a division of labor. I've worked really with very wonderful governments and wonderful politicians. They don't hold seminars and workshops and deliver papers and analyze and argue about the data. They don't have time for any of that. But if the university comes and says, we've done a thorough study of how to make efficient design of Pretoria, or how to convert this part of the country to renewable energy, then they can implement that. We can't implement anything, by the way, but we can come up with the right designs, the training, the logic, the technology, help the businesses. We are not the implementers, actually. I hope we're the educators, the thinkers. I hope that we can inspire young people, because it's their future after all. And I hope that we can be practical and show the way forward. Now, one last word that I want to emphasize in that wonderful title that I was assigned, and that's solidarity. Solidarity applies to us as a community. I know that UNISA is a community, and it is 400,000 strong of students, which is absolutely remarkable. and a great tribute to the profound role of this institution. I want solidarity. I want solidarity across countries and across the world. And for Africa, solidarity for me means African unity, true African unity. African unity started as an organizational form in 1963. The United States, Britain, and France hated it. They don't want African unity. When they saw leaders that would unify like Patrice Lumumba, they killed them or they overthrew them, because empires like divide and conquer. The colonial period left Africa with 54 or 55 countries, depending on how you count it. That's a lot. And each one by itself cannot achieve the future that it wants. It can't resist the diplomacy or the attacks on diplomacy by itself. It can't resist the pressures. It can't resist the financial squeeze. It can't resist the instabilities that come from a market that's too small. Unity is the key. Solidarity is the key. And also, this is why this university is so crucial, because you are not only the University of South Africa, you are a South African university all over Africa. So I'm reading UNISA as Universities of Africa, because you are not only the leader here, but you're a leader across the continent. And so on your own campuses and your connections with other universities around this continent, work together to pull the unity of knowledge, of education, of training, and of good advice to the national governments and to the empowerment of the African Union as a true union. And I want Africa to make the continental free trade area really work. I want this continent is the same size as India and China in population. Actually, a little bit bigger than China, probably just about the same with India right now. 1.5 billion people in Africa, 1.5 billion people in India, 1.4 billion people in China. They're the little one on the block. China ended its poverty in 40 years through good planning and this mass national scale. India is on the path of ending its poverty now. It's about 15 years behind China in the reforms that opened up, that led to the rapid takeoff. It's time for Africa now, as this giant, as a continental scale economy, to be the era of takeoff. And that will come with a continental scale economy and a continental scale strategy. And that means solidarity. So I want to commend you for the wonderful role that you're playing. I would like to say that for me, the single most important investment for the next 20 years is to make sure that this is the fastest learning continent, that this is a continent that is filled with knowledge, filled with education everywhere. By the way, the adults, the children, this should be a time of the greatest advancement of learning and knowledge in Africa, and what you will learn will help light the whole world. Thank you very much.